Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by yours truly, the Package Tourist and the magical mystery tour called life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight's guest is author Mark Van Ells. Mark is a professor of history at Queensborough Community College of the City University of New York. He received his doctorate in history from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in 1999 and taught at Mount Senario College and the University of Wisconsin at Platteville. Dr. Van Ells also served as archivist historian at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison. His first book, To Hear Only Thunder Again, was released in 2001, and in 2009 he released A Traveler's Guide to Wisconsin. Tonight, we will be discussing his latest book, Red Arrow Across the Pacific, the 32nd Infantry during World War II, which was released last September. Mark, welcome to the show. It's an honor and privilege to have you here. And I'd like to start off by asking you, what led you to write about the 32nd Infantry Division in World War II?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. I really appreciate it. The 32nd Infantry Division has its origins in Wisconsin and Michigan, and so do I. It was composed of National Guard units from those two states, and having grown up in Wisconsin, it was sort of always around. You would see the Red Arrow emblem on memorials and parks. In the town I grew up in, there's a Red Arrow Park. Relatives had served in the unit, so it was always part of the world of small-town Wisconsin, I guess. And when I started to study World War II professionally, I noticed that not very much had been written about the 32nd Division, and so I decided to write this book to add the division to the American narrative of the Pacific War.
Out of curiosity, Mark, how did the 32nd Division get the nickname the Red Arrow Division? How? Well,
it originated from the First World War. The division was formed during the First World War, as were all the U.S. Army divisions. You know, that the practice of numbering divisions didn't begin until the First World War, and so that's when the 32nd was formed. It fought in France. It had a very good reputation. It always pierced the German lines, and so at the end of the war, when American divisions began to develop shoulder patches and emblems, the 32nd Division adopted this emblem of a red arrow piercing a horizontal line to symbolize that they had crossed every German line that they encountered, and that arrow was red, and so it became known as the Red Arrow Division.
Okay. Where exactly was the 32nd Infantry stationed in the Pacific?
Well, it was one of the most well-traveled divisions in the U.S. Army, I would say. Even before it got to the Pacific, it had seen a lot of the United States. It trained in Louisiana. Then it was originally scheduled to go to Europe, and so it was shipped to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and then the Army changed its mind, and the division was then sent to California. They had a rail trip all the way across the country, then went to Australia. They arrived there in May of 1942. The first elements arrived in New Guinea in September of 1942, fought the Battle of Buna, went back to Australia for rest and refitting, then went back to New Guinea, then up to the Philippines in late 1944 at Leyte and on the island of Luzon, and then ended up in Japan for occupation duty. The division was first mobilized in October of 1940, and it was finally demobilized in February of 1946. It had racked up 654 hours of combat, more than any other U.S. Army division in all of World War II.
Wow.
So I guess you can say they had the grand tour of World War II.
Now, Mark, when you were researching and writing this book, how many interviews did you use? How many interview hours were you able to acquire to create this book?
Well, I used a lot of interviews from a lot of sources. Thankfully, there have been people who have recorded World War II veterans' experiences, and I was able to use many of them in my research. I did several of them myself. When I was working as an archivist at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, I interviewed several veterans who were in the 32nd Division, and that oral history program continues to this day. They interviewed more veterans after I left. I found interviews with veterans at the Wisconsin Historical Society, Grand Valley State in Michigan, University of North Texas, the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, and of course there's the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. So there I found that there were lots of interviews out there. I should note that in addition to the interviews, the book is based also on the letters and diaries that soldiers wrote, the memoirs they wrote after the war, and I located a good number of those as well, and of course the official records of the division in the National Archives. I spent many hours at College Park in Washington going over the official records as well. So there was a wealth of source material to use for this book.
Now, as a message to readers, when they read this book, is the emphasis more from the foot soldier's perspective, or were you able to interview any commanders or top brass who served in the 32nd Division during the war?
My main emphasis for this book and pretty much everything I've written is with the ordinary soldier. Now, that said, in this book, I did try to portray the division's experience at all the different levels. So I tried to give a portrait of how the war was going and what the major command decisions were, but I always tried to filter that down to how that affected the ordinary soldier.
Now, you said the 32nd Division fought in New Guinea. Let's talk about that. When you were doing your research and when you were talking to the veterans there, how brutal were the conditions in New Guinea? And in addition to fighting the Japanese, what other privations and obstacles these fighting men had to face and endure?
Yeah, New Guinea might be the most difficult place in the world to fight a war. And the Japanese were tenacious enough, as I'm sure many of your listeners who have read World War II books well understand. But this was an island that had virtually no infrastructure to speak of, no highways or roads, no cities really. The island is densely covered with very luxurious jungle. There are open spaces with kunai grass, which is is sharp enough to cut human skin. It's very mountainous and it's very rugged. There are fast-moving streams, intensely hot. Daytime temperatures would average around 90 degrees. Very difficult conditions to operate in, to fight in. Not even so much to fight in, but how do you supply troops? How do you resupply them with ammunition? How do you get food to the troops in a land with virtually no infrastructure? They did a lot of airdrops. They built a lot of roads. They oftentimes had to build them themselves. So the environment was very, very difficult. Now, this is particularly true at the Battle of Buna. Now, this was in 1942, the Papuan campaign, the Battle of Buna. Here, with the U.S. military effort was just getting rolling, so it was particularly difficult to get supplies to the front lines. They had virtually no replacements whatsoever. As the war goes on, those conditions got somewhat better. The U.S. government, the military, had more ships to transport troops with, more engineers to build things, and over time those conditions improved somewhat. But the jungle is the jungle, and it's was a very difficult place to operate in. I might also add the wildlife in New Guinea. These creeks were oftentimes infested with crocodiles, and there was, of course, the mosquito, which led to incredible problems with malaria as well.
Yeah.
I'll note one other thing here also. New Guinea had lots of jungle, but the Philippines, particularly when the division fought on Leyte Island, those conditions were every bit as difficult. That island, too, was covered with jungle, and it was very difficult to operate in those conditions as well. So it was very, very tough fighting.
Getting back to the Battle of Buna-Gona, was that the bloodiest battle that the 32nd Division fought in terms of casualties?
Yeah, that depends on how you look at it, but the short answer is yes. This was the battle where the division had the highest casualty rate. If you combine the number of killed, the number wounded, the number who died in non-combat related accidents, which could include plane crashes and things like this, and there were several of those, neuropsychiatric casualties, and then, of course, the really big problem at Buna in particular was the malaria. So if you add up all of those, at Buna in the Papuan campaign, the Red Arrow Division suffered almost 90% casualties.
Jeez, holy cow.
Yeah, no, that's really stunning. It was a casualty rate that was 6 times higher than it was at Guadalcanal, not to take anything away from Guadalcanal. In terms of the casualty rate, it was really quite stunning. Now, in terms of those killed in battle, if you go to late 1944 and early 1945, there were the back-to-back fights on Leyte, and then after 2 weeks' rest, the division was sent to Luzon. In that stretch, there were more soldiers killed and wounded, but I think, and by that time, malaria had become less of a problem. So I think in terms of the casualty rate, Buna was in fact the toughest, although there were other tough battles as well.
Yeah. Tell me, in terms of strategic significance, isn't it true that once we took Buna-Gona, that allowed the United States, MacArthur's forces, to get access to the north coast of New Guinea and use Buna-Gona as a starting point to conquer the north coast of New Guinea? Is that correct?
Yeah, that was the first. This was the first step that MacArthur had taken to get onto the northern shore of New Guinea, which was a very difficult task. The Papuan Peninsula. This is the far sort of southeastern portion of New Guinea where this fighting took place. There's a very rugged string of mountains called the Owen Stanley Range, and this was exceptionally difficult to get across. The Red Arrow Division sent 1 battalion overland over the mountains, and they quickly learned that that was not a feasible route across the island. The peaks went as high as like 9,000 feet. The malaria problems were tremendous. The supply problems were tremendous. And when this one particular battalion ended up on the other side, they were in virtually no condition to fight. And it was pretty clear that this Kappa Kappa track, as it was known, was not going to be a way across across the island. So just getting onto that northern shore was a very difficult task. But it was at Buna in this Papuan campaign that the Allies first got their troops on the North Shore, and then went from there. And I do need to note that Australians were very critical in this fight as well. There were more Australian troops than Red Arrow soldiers, in fact, in the larger Papuan campaign.
Yeah, I'd like to know that actually the Australians actually helped educate the Americans in how to deal with the jungle. Is that accurate too? They were good teachers?
Yes, and many also had battle experience, which the Red Arrow did not have yet. The Red Arrow was green. Very few Americans had any combat experience whatsoever.
Yeah.
The Marines had been on Guadalcanal for a while, but the Red Arrow was the first U.S. Army division to take on the Japanese. Many of the Australian soldiers had been in the Mediterranean, had some combat experience, and then were rushed back to defend Australia from what seemed like an imminent Japanese invasion. And so the Australians were, in fact, able to tutor the Americans. The Red Arrow learned a lot of really tough lessons in combat, of course, on their own.
Yeah.
But the Australians certainly, their experience was very, very important, critically important to the ultimate victory in Papua.
Now, let's move along now. After the Buna operation, the 32nd, as you note in your book, the 32nd Division had to do extensive rest and recovery, just to replenish their losses and just recover themselves, after the savagery of that battle. And then later on in 44, they take part in it landed at, how you call it, Aitape, Aitape, as part of the Hollandia campaign. Tell me, is it true that the Hollandia campaign is one of the greatest flanking movements in military history?
I think that's probably fair to say. MacArthur famously leapfrogged across the northern shore of New Guinea, bypassing Japanese strong points and taking others. The Marines and the Navy, of course, were doing the very same thing in the Central Pacific. With the Hollandia campaign in particular, MacArthur leaped nearly 500 miles. I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
Like from New York to Cleveland or Toledo or something like that. It was a very large movement. He bypassed the Japanese 18th Army, probably 55,000 soldiers. I would say that that's one of the great flanking movements. Now, Hollandia was the main target. Aitape, where the 32nd Division ended up, was 100 or so miles to the east of that. MacArthur wanted the Japanese airfield there. He couldn't depend on Navy carriers for air cover, so he wanted that airfield. So the Red Arrow did play an indirect role in that Hollandia campaign, which was, I think it's fair to say, one of the great flanking movements, yes.
Talking about General MacArthur, because this was part of General MacArthur's theater. When you were interviewing your soldiers and doing your research, when you went through the interviews, what was the general consensus? What were their views on MacArthur? Because based on what the books I've read, you either loved him or you hated him. When you were talking to those soldiers of the 32nd Division, what was the general consensus? How did they view MacArthur?
Well, it was a very complicated relationship between the 32nd Division and General MacArthur. MacArthur had his origins in Wisconsin, and so you might think that they would have they would get along, but it was a testy, oftentimes, relationship that really dated back to Buna, I think. General MacArthur never went to the fighting front at Buna. He was on the south side of the island where he could be attacked by air, but he never got near the fighting front and kept haranguing the soldiers to advance against the Japanese. But MacArthur had never seen the conditions there. He didn't understand the jungle and the malaria and those sorts of things. And the Japanese had honeycombed the entire area with hundreds and hundreds of bunkers. So when you take the inexperience of the 32nd Division, this was their baptism of fire. Again, they learned quickly, but it was a very tough lessons to learn at first. At first, they didn't have tanks or very much artillery to be able to destroy these bunkers, and MacArthur kept ordering these advances, which would just get people killed. And there was a lot of resentment among the foot soldiers about MacArthur's lack of knowledge about what conditions actually were at the front. And MacArthur seemed to have nursed a grudge against the 32nd Division for the rest of the war, really. He still talked about this later on in the war, still continued to say negative things about the 32nd Division. So it was a testy relationship. I might also add that the 32nd Division was a National Guard division, and among the regular Army commanders, there was oftentimes a lot of suspicion of National Guard units and National Guard officers in particular, and so I think that undoubtedly played a role in the way MacArthur and other high brass in the Army tended to view the 32nd Division. So, you know, it's typical for the ordinary foot soldier to grumble about those on the top of the command structure. But this relationship between the 32nd Division and MacArthur did seem to be particularly strained, shall we say.
Okay. Now, when MacArthur came ashore at Leyte in October 1944, did he do so in the 32nd Division's AO, or was it a different division?
He did not, because the 32nd Division wasn't yet at Leyte.
Okay.
MacArthur famously splashed ashore. He returned. This was October of 1944.
Yeah.
At this time, the 32nd Division was at Hollandia, and there was a regiment that was on the island of Morotai.
Yeah.
And they came north in November of 1944. So they missed the initial invasion. When they got there, I mean, the Japanese were still attacking. Leyte famously is where the Japanese first launched their kamikaze attacks.
Yeah.
And those sorts of things were still going on when the division first arrived in November, and then it was sent up to the fighting front in November.
Just a quick question. Was the 32nd Division part of Walter Kruger's 6th Army, or was it part of Bob Eichelberger's 8th Army?
It was mostly part of the 6th Army through almost the entire war. At the very end of the war, there were some changes in command, and then when they got to Japan, there were some, administrative changes. But it was 6th Army through all of the important fighting.
Okay. Now, when they landed on Luzon, that was at Lingayen Gulf, right, January 9th of 45. So we just had the anniversary of that, correct, Mark?
Yeah, but again, the 32nd Division came in a little bit later.
Okay.
They had been fighting on Leyte and had been doing so like through the Christmas holidays, with much grumbling, I might add, among the soldiers. And so they had about 2 weeks rest, and then they went up to Lingayen Gulf a little bit later. If I recall correctly, maybe 2 weeks after the initial invasion.
Okay. So they were not part of the drive towards Manila, correct? Or is that a different part of Luzon they fought in?
No, they were not part of that at all. They were focused on northern Luzon. They began to move into the Caraballo Mountains and towards the Cagayan Valley in the far northern part of the island. So that there was the 1st Cavalry, among others, who got the glory of going to Manila. The 32nd Division, they were fighting General Yamashita, who had basically barricaded himself in the mountains of northern Luzon. They were tasked with moving into the mountains eventually to defeat Yamashita's forces.
Okay. Let's see. Let's talk, Mark. Let's talk about yourself now. Where were you born and raised?
Well, as I noted, I'm from Wisconsin. I was born and raised in a small industrial city named Manitowoc. It's not far from Green Bay, which of course is famous for its football team. I was born and raised there. I'll add that Manitowoc had its own illustrious World War II history. It's a port city on Lake Michigan, and it had a shipbuilding industry, and during World War II, among other things, it built submarines. You don't think of the Great Lakes as a place to build submarines, but all the electricians and the welders and everything the military needed was there. The shipbuilding company there landed the contract, and so they built, I think, 28 submarines during the Second World War. Maybe Manitowoc's finest hour is certainly well remembered there. And perhaps I absorbed that as a kid. The Wisconsin Maritime Museum is there now. There's a World War II era submarine that's there. So maybe that is one of the things, subliminally, I guess, that maybe drove me in the direction of studying World War II. Right out of high school, I joined the Air Force. I was in the Air Force for 4 years. Attended briefly University of Massachusetts, and then went back to Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I got all my degrees.
Okay. Now, Mark, what led you to become a writer?
Well, that's a tough question. I can say that I've always been interested in history, I guess.
Okay.
Even I remember family vacations, we went to go see Lincoln's Log Cabin. I'm one of these people, I can't walk through a park without looking at the monuments in there. And it's been that way for pretty much as long as I can remember. And I've always wanted to write. I'm not exactly sure why. It's hard to explain that, but it's something I always wanted to do, and I'm really privileged to be able to do that as a career.
Mark, whenever I interview an author on my show, I always love to ask the standard question. When you were growing up, who were your favorite authors? And of those favorite authors, did any of them inspire you to become a writer or perhaps influence your personal writing style?
You got another tough question there, don't you? I would say that someone I really liked to read when I was younger was John Steinbeck. I think I read The Pearl in high school, or maybe later, I can't remember, and I was really interested by Steinbeck. I wouldn't have been able to even articulate this back then, but I think what I really liked about Steinbeck was his clear, crisp prose. It's really clean. He gets right to the point, and what I really like about Steinbeck is that his work tended to focus on ordinary folks. From The Grapes of Wrath to many of the other works that he wrote, Tortilla Flat, Cannery Row, things like that. He always had that sort of interest in the ordinary person. And in my own writing, when I write about history, I try to keep my prose clean, and I do tend to focus on, as we noted before, the ordinary foot soldier over the generals and command decisions and presidential orders and those sorts of things. So looking back, I think Steinbeck was certainly my favorite writer when I was younger, and probably influenced my own writing to this day.
Mark, please tell our listeners, where can readers find your books, especially A Red Hour Across the Pacific? Where can they find it?
Well, it can be found on major online retailers. I will not do any advertising for any of them, but I'm sure most of your listeners know what I'm talking about. And you can also find it through independent bookstores, either through their online shops or perhaps in the stores. Perhaps museum gift shops and history, World War II history museums. You might find it in the gift shop there, and of course you can find it through the Wisconsin Historical Society's website. That's the publisher, and you can find it on their online shop as well.
I just like to tell listeners, you can find Mark Van Ells' books, at Amazon. He has a web page there. His book Red Arrow, you can find it easily there. Just type in Red Arrow Across the Pacific, and it'll come up on Amazon. Go out and get it, ladies and gentlemen. Mark, I'd like to end up by this. What is your next book project, and when can we expect its release?
Oh, I don't know about that. This one was a big project. I'm playing with a few things. I wrote an article a few years ago about the kinds of souvenirs that GIs collected during World War II. I'm exploring turning that into a book-length manuscript. As you noted, I also wrote a Wisconsin travel guide. I also wrote a World War I travel guide looking at World War I historic sites in this country and, of course, overseas as well. And I really enjoyed writing those books. It was not a bad thing to rent a car in France and travel to these areas on the Western Front and places where few tourists get. It was fun and interesting, and I might like to do something like that again as well. So at this point, I'm just sort of exploring my options. When can you find my next book? It's not going to be for a while. Those kinds of works will take a while to finish. But I'm exploring other possibilities right now.
Well, if you ever do come out with your next book, please let me know. I'd love to have you on my show again, Mark.
Will do.
Mark, I want to thank you so much for being on the show, and I wish you the best of luck in all your endeavors.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much.
Take care, sir. Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show, where I will be interviewing British historian Jackson van Uden. Thank you and good night.